The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the Sunset Palms Motel as Maggie Sterling pulled into the parking space beside room 237. She checked her watch. 4:30 p.m., perfect timing. Richard would never expect her to arrive 2 hours early with dinner reservations. At that fancy waterfront restaurant he'd mentioned wanting to try. Maggie smoothed her blonde hair and grabbed the small gift bag from the passenger seat. 15 years of marriage deserved celebrating, even if this Florida vacation felt more like an obligation than a romantic getaway. She'd been working 60-hour weeks at the marketing firm, and Richard had been distant lately. Buried in his real estate deals back in Ohio, the motel was nothing special, a throwback to the 1960s with its pink and turquoise paint job and neon sign that would light up the night. But it sat right on Seaside Bay's harbor, and Richard had insisted it would be charming. She slipped the spare keycard from her purse and approached the door. The sound of laughter stopped her cold. Richard's laugh, but softer somehow, more intimate than she'd heard in months. Maggie pressed her ear to the door and heard a woman's voice, light and musical. Her heart began to race. With trembling fingers, she slid the keycard into the lock. The green light blinked, and she pushed the door open slowly. The scene before her seemed to unfold in slow motion. Richard stood by the window in a white hotel bathrobe, his arms wrapped around a young blonde woman in a flowing white dress. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting them in golden light like some twisted romantic movie scene. The woman's head was tilted against Richard's shoulder, and his hand was stroking her hair. They both froze when they heard the door. The woman gasped and stepped back, her blue eyes wide with shock. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Happy anniversary, darling," Maggie said, her voice unnaturally calm as she set the dinner reservation card on the small table by the door. "I brought you a surprise." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The woman clutched her white dress and looked between them, clearly wanting to disappear. Richard opened his mouth several times before any words came out. "Maggie, I can explain. Can you?" She looked at the rumpled bed, at the woman's purse on the nightstand, at the champagne bottle cooling in the ice bucket. "Please do." Richard stepped toward her, his hands raised as if approaching a wild animal. "This isn't what it looks like. Jennifer is a client who requires champagne and hotel rooms." Maggie's voice was getting higher, despite her efforts to stay calm. "A client who gets cozy with you in bathrobes?" The blonde woman, Jennifer, finally found her voice. "I should go." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but Maggie stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Oh no, please don't let me interrupt your business meeting." Richard grabbed Maggie's arm as she turned to leave. "Don't be ridiculous. This is just work stress. You've been so busy with your job, we never talk anymore." "It doesn't mean anything." She pulled free from his grip and stared at him. The man she'd married 20 years ago, who'd promised to love and honor her, who'd held her hand through her mother's funeral and celebrated every promotion with her. When had he become this stranger? "Doesn't mean anything," she repeated slowly. "I see." Maggie walked out of the room and didn't look back, even when Richard called her name. She made it to her rental car before the tears started, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the ignition. She drove without destination through the winding streets of Seaside Bay, past the harbor where fishing boats bobbed in the early evening light, past the small downtown with its antique shops and seafood restaurants. Her phone buzzed with texts from Richard, but she ignored them. Finally, she pulled into a parking spot near the water and called her sister Beth back in Columbus. "Maggie, how's the romantic getaway?" Beth's cheerful voice made the tears flow harder. "He's cheating on me," Maggie whispered. "I walked in on them." The silence on the other end stretched before Beth exploded with indignation. They talked for 20 minutes, Beth alternating between fury at Richard and concern for her sister. When they hung up, Maggie felt empty and exhausted. She was about to start the car when a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped and pressed her hand to her breastbone. The pain came again, radiating down her left arm. Her vision blurred slightly and she felt dizzy. This wasn't heartbreak. This was something else entirely. Maggie remembered seeing signs for the hospital when she'd driven through town. She started the car with trembling hands and drove slowly, focusing on breathing. The pain came in waves now, and her left arm felt heavy and strange. Seaside Bay Community Hospital was a small, modern building with a red emergency sign glowing in the dusk. Maggie stumbled through the automatic doors, clutching her chest. "I need help," she gasped to the receptionist. "Something's wrong with my heart." The next few minutes were a blur of urgent voices and rolling gurneys. She found herself in a small treatment room, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment. A tall man in scrubs with kind brown eyes was attaching electrodes to her chest. "I'm Dr. Carpenter," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Tell me what you're feeling." "Sharp pain in my chest, and my left arm feels numb," Maggie managed. "I thought it was just stress, but when did it start?" He was working quickly, checking her blood pressure and watching the monitor that was now beeping steadily. "About 20 minutes ago. I was sitting in my car and suddenly—" She winced as another wave of pain hit. Dr. Carpenter frowned at the monitor readout. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm going to be direct with you. Your EKG is showing some very concerning patterns. This isn't a panic attack or stress response. You're having cardiac episodes that could lead to a major event." "A major event?" "A heart attack." His brown eyes were serious but gentle. "If you hadn't come in tonight, you could have had a massive cardiac event within hours. Possibly fatal." The room seemed to tilt around her. "But I'm only 42. I exercise. I don't smoke. Sometimes these things have nothing to do with lifestyle. There can be underlying conditions, genetic factors, or in rare cases, severe emotional trauma can trigger a cardiac crisis in people with undiagnosed vulnerabilities." He was preparing an IV as he spoke. "The important thing is, you're here now, and we're going to take care of you." As the medication began to flow through her system, Maggie felt the crushing irony of the situation. Catching her husband with another woman had driven her to seek medical attention that might have saved her life. She started to laugh, a sound that bordered on hysteria. "Mrs. Sterling?" Dr. Carpenter looked concerned. "Are you feeling lightheaded?" "My husband," she said, tears mixing with laughter. "I caught him cheating tonight. I was so upset I thought my heart was breaking. Turns out it literally was." The morning light filtered through the hospital room blinds as Dr. Carpenter entered with a clipboard and a reassuring smile. Maggie had spent the night hooked to monitors, drifting in and out of sleep between the nurses' hourly checks. She felt surprisingly rested, considering everything that had happened. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling. How are you feeling?" James, she'd learned his first name during their late-night conversation when sleep eluded them both, pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Better, I think. The chest pain is gone." She adjusted herself to sit up straighter. "You said I have a heart condition. It's called stress-induced cardiomyopathy, sometimes known as broken heart syndrome. It can mimic a heart attack, but it's actually caused by a surge of stress hormones that temporarily weaken the heart muscle." He showed her the test results. "In your case, it was triggered by severe emotional trauma. But here's the concerning part. You also have an underlying arrhythmia that we discovered during your monitoring. Without treatment, that could have caused a fatal episode." Maggie stared at the EKG printouts, trying to process the medical terminology. "So if I hadn't come to the hospital last night, you might not have woken up this morning," James said gently. "The emotional shock actually saved your life by bringing you here." The irony wasn't lost on her. She was contemplating this when the door burst open and Richard strode in, carrying an enormous bouquet of roses and wearing his most contrite expression. "Maggie, sweetheart, I came as soon as I heard." He rushed to her bedside, setting the flowers on the windowsill. "The front desk told me you were admitted with heart problems. I'm so sorry about yesterday." "The stress I caused—" "Mr. Sterling," James interrupted, noticing how the monitors had immediately started beeping faster when Richard entered. Maggie's blood pressure was spiking visibly on the screen. "It's fine," Richard said dismissively, not even looking at the doctor. Maggie, we need to talk. What happened yesterday was a misunderstanding. Jennifer is a client from Miami, and we were discussing a property deal. Things got out of hand, but it meant nothing. The beeping grew more insistent. James stepped closer to the bed, his professional instincts taking over. Mr. Sterling, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. Your wife needs to remain calm for her recovery. I'm her husband, Richard snapped, finally acknowledging James's presence. I think I know what she needs better than some small-town doctor. Actually, what she needs right now is rest and stress reduction, James replied firmly. Her condition is directly linked to emotional trauma, and your presence is clearly agitating her. Richard's face reddened. Are you suggesting that I'm bad for my wife's health? I'm suggesting that you give her space to heal, James said calmly, though Maggie could see the tension in his jaw. Richard leaned closer to James, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper that Maggie could still hear. I know what you're trying to do, Doctor. But she's my wife, and we're going home to Ohio tomorrow. With that, he stormed out, leaving the roses and a suffocating silence in his wake. James checked Maggie's monitors as her heart rate slowly returned to normal. I'm sorry about that, he said quietly. Don't apologize for him, Maggie replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. You were protecting me. He wasn't. Later that afternoon, James found Maggie in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a turkey sandwich. She'd changed into her own clothes, jeans and a soft blue sweater that brought out her eyes, and looked more like herself again. Mind if I join you? He held a coffee cup and had traded his scrubs for khakis and a button-down shirt. Please do. I was getting tired of my own thoughts. They sat in comfortable conversation for a while. Maggie learned that James had moved to Seaside Bay 3 years ago after his divorce, bringing his teenage daughter Emma for a fresh start. He'd been an ER doctor in Tampa before deciding he wanted a slower pace and more time with Emma. What made you leave the city? Maggie asked. My ex-wife had an affair with my business partner, James said matter-of-factly. When I found out, I realized Emma and I deserved better than the mess we were living in. Small-town life has been good for us. I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. It was, but it taught me something important about trust. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. He studied her face. What about you? What do you do back in Ohio? I run marketing campaigns for tech startups. It's demanding but rewarding, or it was, until I started feeling like I was just going through the motions. She paused. I think I've been sleepwalking through my life for years. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and frowned. Richard? James asked. She showed him the screen. That blonde was just a client. Come home. James's expression darkened as he read the message. Mrs. Sterling, I don't usually involve myself in patients' personal lives, but that woman wasn't dressed like any real estate client I've ever seen. What do you mean? I saw her in the parking lot yesterday evening when I was leaving work. She was getting into a car with out-of-state plates, and she was very affectionate with someone on the phone. It didn't seem like business. The next day, James offered to show Maggie around Seaside Bay while she waited for her discharge paperwork. They walked along the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed in the gentle waves and pelicans perched on weathered dock posts. The afternoon sun cast everything in golden light. It's beautiful here, Maggie said, breathing in the salt air. So peaceful compared to Columbus. Emma loves it. She's 16 now, and she's finally happy at school. That makes everything worth it. James pointed to a small cafe overlooking the water. She works there part-time, saving for college. They found a bench near the water's edge and sat watching the boats. Maggie found herself talking about things she'd never shared with anyone. Her dreams of starting her own marketing consultancy, her fear that she'd wasted the best years of her life, her growing realization that her marriage had been hollow for longer than she wanted to admit. I used to love Richard's confidence, she said. He made decisions quickly, took charge of situations. But somewhere along the way, that became him making decisions for me, not with me. You deserve someone who sees you as an equal partner, James said quietly. A comfortable silence settled between them. Maggie was struck by how easy it was to talk to this man she'd known for less than 2 days. There was something solid and trustworthy about him that she realized had been missing from her life for a very long time. Their peaceful moment was shattered when Richard appeared from behind a cluster of fishing boats, his face twisted with rage. "Get away from my wife!" he shouted, striding toward them with clenched fists. James stood immediately, positioning himself slightly in front of Maggie. "Mr. Sterling, please calm down." "Calm down. I find my wife cozy with her doctor on some romantic beach walk, and you want me to calm down?" Richard's voice carried across the harbor, drawing stares from other visitors. "We were just talking," Maggie said, rising from the bench. "James was showing me the town." "James." Richard's voice dripped with disdain. "How quickly we've moved to first names. How touching." "You have no right to be angry," Maggie said, her own voice rising. "Not after what I walked in on yesterday. That was business, and you know it. This is different. This is my wife being seduced by some small-town doctor who thinks he can play hero." James stepped forward, his calm demeanor intact, but his eyes flashing with anger. "Mr. Sterling, you're making a scene. Your wife is recovering from a serious medical event, and she doesn't need this stress." "Don't tell me what my wife needs," Richard snarled. "And don't think I don't see what you're doing here. Playing the savior, the shoulder to cry on. It's pathetic." The confrontation was drawing more attention. Other people on the harbor walk had stopped to stare, and Maggie felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. "Richard, stop it," she said firmly. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself." He laughed bitterly. "You're the one making a fool of yourself with Dr. Dogood here." That was when James's composure finally cracked. "That's enough. You need to walk away right now." "Or what?" Richard stepped closer, his chest puffed out in aggressive challenge. The two men stood facing each other, the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Before the confrontation could escalate further, an elderly woman approached from the harbor cafe, wiping her hands on an apron. She was small but carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Excuse me," she said firmly, addressing Richard. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, and I manage the Sunset Palms Motel. I think you and I need to have a conversation." Richard's aggressive posture deflated slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Mrs. Patterson replied, her weathered face set in disapproving lines. "Mrs. Sterling, could I speak with you privately? There are some things you need to know about your husband's business arrangements." Maggie looked between the older woman and Richard, whose face had gone pale. "What kind of things?" "The kind that might help you understand the full scope of what you discovered yesterday." Mrs. Patterson's eyes never left Richard's face. "Room 237 has quite a history." 20 minutes later, Maggie sat in Mrs. Patterson's cramped office behind the motel lobby, staring at a shoebox full of credit card receipts. Her hands trembled as she sorted through them. Monthly charges for room 237 going back over 2 years. Sometimes multiple times per month. "I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer, honey," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "That man has been bringing different women to that room regularly. Young ones, older ones, all of them thinking they were special. I should have said something sooner, but I figured it wasn't my business until I saw your face yesterday." The receipts told a devastating story. Dates that coincided with Richard's supposed business trips. Charges from when Maggie had been battling her cancer scare 3 years ago, when she'd been too sick and frightened to question his frequent absences. Even charges from their wedding anniversary last year, when Richard claimed he'd been in Cincinnati closing a deal. This one here, Mrs. Patterson pointed to a receipt from 18 months ago. That was the first time he brought the blonde girl. Jennifer, he called her. Pretty little thing, but she looked so young. Couldn't have been more than 25. Maggie's vision blurred with tears of rage and humiliation. 2 years. He's been doing this for 2 years. I'm afraid it might be longer than that, dear. I only took over managing this place 2 years ago. The previous manager might have records too, but she moved to Jacksonville. The full weight of Richard's betrayal crashed over her. Not just the physical infidelity, but the elaborate deception, the calculated lies, the way he'd made her feel crazy for questioning his absences. While she'd been worried about their marriage growing distant, he'd been building an entirely separate life. That evening, Maggie confronted Richard at their beach house rental. She spread the receipts across the dining table like evidence in a courtroom. "Explain these," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Richard barely glanced at the papers. "You went through my personal business records." "Your personal business records? Is that what you call systematic adultery now?" "Don't be dramatic, Maggie. These are legitimate business expenses. I meet clients at the motel sometimes because it's convenient and private. For 2 years. The same room. With champagne service?" Her voice was rising. "Do you think I'm stupid, Richard?" He sank into a chair, his mask of denial finally slipping. "Fine, yes, I've seen other women. But it doesn't mean anything, Maggie. You were so focused on your career, so busy with your projects. We barely talked anymore, so it's my fault." "It's nobody's fault. It's just life. Marriage gets stale, people need excitement. It doesn't change how I feel about you. How you feel about me?" Maggie laughed bitterly. "You were cheating on me while I was sick. While I was scared I might have cancer, you were in that motel room with strangers. You don't understand the pressure I was under." Richard stood, reaching for her. "Supporting you through that, keeping the business running. Don't touch me." She stepped back. "And don't you dare make yourself the victim in this." The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted them. Through the window, Maggie saw James's Honda Civic. He'd called earlier to check on her medical condition, and she'd mentioned the confrontation with Mrs. Patterson. James knocked and entered when Maggie called out. He took in the scene, the scattered receipts, Richard's defensive posture, Maggie's tear-stained face. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said quietly. "Your blood pressure was elevated when I saw you this afternoon." "She's fine," Richard snapped. "This is a private family matter." "Actually, it's a medical matter," James replied. "Mrs. Sterling's cardiac condition requires monitoring, especially during stressful situations." Richard grabbed Maggie's wrist suddenly, his fingers tightening with enough force to make her wince. "You don't need to involve outsiders in our personal business. Let go of her." James's voice was low and dangerous. "Or what?" Richard's grip tightened. James stepped between them, forcing Richard to release Maggie's wrist. "Or I'll call the police and report domestic assault." "You'll regret interfering in my marriage, Doctor," Richard said, his voice filled with venom. "I promise you that." Later that night, James sat in his car in the hospital parking lot, waiting for roadside assistance. His Honda had refused to start after his shift, the engine making ominous clicking sounds when he turned the key. He'd called for a tow truck, but they were running late. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in stark shadows. James was reading patient charts on his tablet when footsteps approached his car. Richard Sterling emerged from the darkness, his face twisted with rage. "I told you you'd regret getting involved," Richard said, leaning against the car door. "Mr. Sterling, what are you doing here?" "Making sure you understand the consequences of your actions." Richard's voice was calm, which somehow made it more threatening. "I've already filed a complaint with the State Medical Board about your inappropriate conduct with my wife. Unethical doctor-patient relationships are serious business." James felt his blood run cold. "There was no inappropriate conduct. That's not how I see it. That's not how I've described it to the medical board or to your hospital administrator." Funny how these things can snowball, isn't it? One complaint leads to an investigation, which leads to questions about your judgment, your professionalism. "You're lying." Richard smiled coldly. "Am I? I have witnesses who saw you with my wife at the harbor. I have records of you spending excessive time with her, taking her on walks, having intimate conversations. How do you think that looks to a review board?" The implications hit James like a physical blow. A medical board investigation could destroy his career, his reputation, his ability to provide for Emma. Even if the charges were eventually dismissed, the damage would be done. "My daughter lives here," James said quietly. "She has friends, a job, a life she loves. Should have thought about that before you decided to play marriage counselor with my wife." Richard straightened up. "Stay away from Maggie, and maybe I'll reconsider my complaint. Keep interfering, and I'll make sure you never practice medicine again." As Richard walked away into the darkness, James sat in his broken-down car, feeling the weight of his world crashing down around him. Emma's college fund, their quiet life in Seaside Bay, his ability to help people like Maggie, all of it hanging by a thread because he'd tried to protect a woman who'd needed help. When the tow truck finally arrived, James barely spoke to the driver. Inside his head, he kept hearing Richard's threats, seeing Emma's disappointed face when she'd have to leave the town she'd grown to love. "I should never have trusted anyone again," he said quietly to himself as he watched his car being loaded onto the truck. From across the parking lot, hidden behind another car, Maggie had witnessed the entire confrontation. She'd come to the hospital to thank James for his kindness, arriving just in time to see Richard's threatening approach. Her heart broke as she watched the defeat settle over James's shoulders, knowing she was responsible for bringing this trouble into his life. The next morning, Maggie sat on the beach at Sunrise Point, watching the dawn paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The steady rhythm of the waves had always calmed her, but today her mind was racing with the terrible realization of what Richard had done. She thought about the past few days, how catching Richard's infidelity had led her to the hospital, where she'd met James, how that medical emergency had literally saved her life by revealing her heart condition, how James had risked his career to protect her from Richard's manipulation and threats. Mrs. Patterson found her there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the Harbor Cafe. "Figured you might need some company," the older woman said, settling beside her on the sand. "I've destroyed an innocent man's life," Maggie said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "James tried to help me, and now Richard is going after his medical license." "That doctor saved your life twice, honey," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Once medically, and once by showing you what a decent man looks like. Don't let Richard's poison make you forget that. But what can I do? Richard has filed complaints with the medical board. Even if they're false, the investigation alone could ruin James's reputation." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, watching a fishing boat navigate toward the harbor. "You know, I've been running motels for 30 years. You learn to keep good records, pay attention to details. Sometimes that information becomes useful in unexpected ways." She pulled out her phone and showed Maggie a video file. "Security cameras have been a godsend for motel owners. We see all kinds of behavior in our parking lots." The video showed Richard approaching James's car the night before, their heated conversation, Richard's threatening gestures. The timestamp proved it had happened after Richard filed his medical board complaint, showing clear evidence of intimidation and retaliation. "Richard made a big mistake threatening that doctor where my cameras could see him," Mrs. Patterson said with satisfaction. "This footage, combined with his pattern of behavior at my motel, paints quite a picture of his character." For the first time in days, Maggie felt hope stirring in her chest. Maybe there was a way to fight back after all. An hour later, Maggie walked into the hospital administrator's office with Mrs. Patterson, a folder of evidence and a grim determination to set things right. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the chief of staff, listened carefully as Maggie explained the situation and presented the security footage. "This is quite serious," Dr. Martinez said after viewing the video. "If Mr. Sterling filed a false complaint and then attempted to intimidate Dr. Carpenter, that's multiple violations of our policy and potentially criminal behavior. I also have text messages where Richard threatened James," Maggie added, showing her phone, "and evidence of Richard's pattern of deception and manipulation." Dr. Martinez made several phone calls, including one to the state medical board and another to the hospital's legal department. Within 2 hours, Richard's complaint had been withdrawn and flagged as potentially fraudulent. A restraining order was filed to prevent him from coming near James or the hospital. "Dr. Carpenter's record will show no disciplinary action," Dr. Martinez assured Maggie. "In fact, his handling of your medical emergency was exemplary. and his professional conduct throughout this ordeal has been beyond reproach. As they left the administrator's office, Maggie felt lighter than she had in years. She was also filing for divorce, and her lawyer had informed her that Richard's business partners were very interested in the financial irregularities she'd uncovered in his motel receipts. James appeared in the hallway looking tired but relieved. "I hear I have my guardian angel to thank," he said, his warm smile returning for the first time since the harbor confrontation. "You saved my life first," Maggie replied. "I was just returning the favor." 6 months later, Maggie stood in her new office overlooking Seaside Bay Harbor, putting the finishing touches on a marketing campaign for a local restaurant chain. She'd moved to Florida permanently after her divorce was finalized, using her settlement money to start her own consultancy. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways her old corporate job had never been. The afternoon sun streamed through her office windows as James arrived with coffee, and his daughter Emma, a bright 16-year-old with her father's kind eyes and an infectious laugh. "How was school, Em?" Maggie asked, accepting her usual afternoon cappuccino. "Great! I got accepted to the University of Florida's early admission program," Emma announced proudly. "Pre-med, just like Dad." "That's wonderful," Maggie said, hugging the girl who'd become like a daughter to her over the past months. James and Maggie had taken their relationship slowly, building it on a foundation of genuine friendship and mutual respect. They'd both been wounded by betrayal, but they'd found healing in each other's honesty and kindness. "Ready for dinner?" James asked, taking Maggie's hand as they prepared to leave the office. "Always," she replied, then paused to look out at the harbor where it all began. "You know, if someone had told me 6 months ago that catching Richard cheating would lead to the best chapter of my life, I'd have thought they were crazy. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually disguised blessings," James said, following her gaze to the water. Emma ran ahead toward the harbor restaurant, calling back over her shoulder, "Come on, you two! Our table's waiting and I'm starving." As they walked toward the restaurant together, the golden sunset reflecting off the calm waters of Seaside Bay, Maggie felt a peace she'd never known in her marriage to Richard. She'd discovered that sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed. The three of them were silhouetted against the sunset as they entered the restaurant, ready to share another evening as the family they'd chosen to become. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.